Welcome to another Digital Dairy Sunday School. The last couple weeks we've been talking about this idea of evolving consciousness. First starting with this idea of the tribal culture in the Hebrew Scriptures, how it is so different than our current understanding, our culture, our worldview. And so to understand the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, we have to understand the mindset, the worldview in which all these authors were writing. Then we talked about what to do with all those violent stories in the Old Testament. How do we reconcile that with what we believe about God? And this week we're going to talk about humans and their God stories. Why do we tell the stories of God the way we do? Now, have you ever had someone throw out Old Testament stories of God to you as a way to show you that God is mean, angry, judgmental, or to explain why some people should go to hell or why God doesn't like this or that? Do you know people who seem to always counter something good about God with something negative, as if they enjoy the idea of God smiting people or sending them to hell? See, here's the thing. I don't read the Bible like a flat line. I don't see all of the passages in the Bible sitting equally side by side so that you can pick one and then counter it with another and go back and forth endlessly, always leading you to the randomness of God. I read it as an unfolding story with an arc, a trajectory, a movement and momentum like all great stories have. There are earlier parts in the story, and there are later parts in the story. The story is headed somewhere, and as a Christian, I see it headed to Jesus. Because of this, I read it through the lens of Jesus, especially the parts that come before the specifically Jesus parts. And while I try to understand those in the current context of when they were written, and with that Jewish worldview, I also look at it through the lens of Jesus. So a couple key things to review. First, the Bible was written by people. People wrote things down over a long period of time. These things they wrote down, some of which began as oral tradition, gradually took shape as the library we know to be the Bible. Books were left out, writings were edited, things were added, decisions were made about which books belonged, and eventually the library of books we know to be the Bible came to be the Bible. Now, these things people wrote down reflected how they saw the world at their time and their contexts. These stories they told and the explanations they gave for how and why things happened like they did were filtered through their particular consciousness. When you read the Bible, then, you are reading an unfolding narrative that reflects the growing and expanding human consciousness. When you read it as an unfolding story, you don't edit out the earlier bits or pretend like they're not there. You read them in light of where the story is headed. That doesn't mean the earlier bits are bad or worthless. They're just earlier. That's how people understood things at that point in the story, but the story kept going. Give an example. The story of A Christmas Carol is one of my pet peeves, and we all have pet peeves, but one of the things I get annoyed about, which I shouldn't get that annoyed, and yet I still get that annoyed, we all have those things, is when people talk about, don't be such a Scrooge, or don't be a Scrooge about Christmas. You see, what they're doing is they're taking the earliest parts of A Christmas Carol, Scrooge as he is in stave 1, and not considering the growth of Scrooge through the rest of the book. They are plucking Scrooge out of the earliest part of the story and basically holding that as timeless definition of who Scrooge is, but that's not how stories work. Characters should evolve in stories. So by the end of the book, Dickens writes of Scrooge, if anyone could keep Christmas in their heart, it would be Scrooge. You want to be a Scrooge. You want to be a Scrooge at Christmas. You want to be joyful and generous. But when we talk about don't be a Scrooge, we're making the earliest part of the story be as important as the end. And that's not how it should work. Stories should evolve. The Bible is a story that evolves. The people in the Bible evolve. how we understand God evolves. When we try to make everything equal, like, say, the Bill of Rights, where every one of those rights should be basically equal to the other, we're doing ourselves a disservice to reading the Bible, because the earlier parts are the earlier parts for a reason. They haven't evolved and spread. We have to take it as where the story is going. It doesn't mean we just chop off the Old Testament. It gives a record of how things go. There's still important parts in there. But you can't hold everything as equal as a static story. More on that in a bit. But I think this is why we sometimes cringe during those sermons, hopefully not mine, maybe mine, when the preacher reads some gruesome story in the Bible and then tries to explain it in a way that gets everybody all tied up in knots. The preacher at that moment is treating the Bible like a static report rather than the unfolding narrative it is. When you understand it as a static report, then you're constantly having to defend God and explain why that God is not as evil and cruel as that God clearly appears to be. You're endlessly trying to reconcile earlier parts in the story with later parts, trying to make them sit side by side on a flat plane as equals when it was never designed to be that way. It leaves you stunted, furthering the stilted literalism that robs these stories of their life. It's awkward and unconvincing, and it's why lots and lots and lots of people don't want to sit through sermons like that. Side note, we see all these articles about why people aren't going to church today, and there's all kinds of reasons, but one that never gets lifted up is this idea that a lot of people have moved beyond the tribal, violent, magical, mythical consciousness that exists in parts of the Bible, especially the Hebrew Scriptures. They have moved on to something new, but when they hear things in church, it's like they're being pulled back into this worldview, and we're trying to make sense and shove that worldview into where we are now. And they don't want to be pulled back into that. They see that as a step backwards, which is why churches need to not try to take the round peg of the worldview of the Bible and jam it into the square hole of our world today. We need to understand the Bible as it was written well enough to understand how it relates to our worldview today, how they can stand side by side instead of mashing them together in a way that's always going to just produce a whole bunch of disconnects. That was a side note. So for whatever reasons, the Bible comes out of actual human history, reflecting the funky, flawed, brilliant, frustrating people who told these stories and wrote these books. It reflects growth and maturing and expanding perspectives, much like an individual grows and matures. Now, are you proud of everything you've ever said? Are there things you have said and done that if we were to hear them and see them now, you'd be mortified? Of course. We shouldn't all be judged on things we said when we were 15. I sometimes feel bad for professional athletes and things. When they get drafted at 24 or 25, they suddenly get in trouble because somebody found something they tweeted when they were 15 and it was stupid. And now they might lose their job. They get in all kinds of trouble. Should they learn from those moments? Absolutely. Should we all be held to a standard of this is who you are forever with things we said 25 years ago? No. We can ask questions, but we should all grow. I don't want the world to know everything I said when I was a teenager and assume that's how I still am today. And I'm betting you don't either. Another sidebar. I get annoyed when we get mad at politicians when they change their points of view. We bring something out that says, well, they said this in 1965, so obviously they must still think that. Maybe we can ask, but they also might have changed their mind. I would hope politicians have changed their understanding and thinking on things over 40 or 50 years. I know I have, and I'm pretty sure you have. We give each other grace, assuming that as we get new information, as we have new experiences, how we think about the world is going to be different. I'm guessing there are lots of things you think now that maybe you thought the exact opposite of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. If we give ourselves that grace, we understand that about ourselves, why can't we understand that about the Bible and the stories being written then? So it shouldn't surprise us that in this very human recording of where we've been called the Bible, there are parts that are shocking and repulsive that don't seem to jive with the rest of it. It's because they reflected the earlier bits in the story. And the earlier parts of the story are often like that. Just like how you were when you were a teenager, it's probably not the you want to reflect to the world today. Which raises the questions about the many ways in which we haven't progressed in the modern world, still furthering some of the same warped and twisted ways, but that's another lesson. That sometimes the things we don't like in the Hebrew Scriptures we're still doing, and we don't like them, and yet we're still doing them. We haven't progressed as much as we might think we have sometimes. You see, God has this funny habit of using actual people to get the word out. And people, as they do, have agendas and perspectives and particular consciousness. People make decisions and leave things out and include things that weren't there earlier. And in forming the Bible, people decided what God said and what God didn't say. Books were compiled from various authors, edited together and mashed together. People sometimes added things later, and then it became part of the regular book. It's how the Bible was formed. That's the Bible. And however divine or inspired or revelatory we believe it to be, we'll only get there if we start with the humanity of this book. If you start there, you might just find something divine, but only if you start there. And I know that scares some people. But honestly, I find the Bible more comforting knowing it was written by humans like me, who had experiences of God and were trying to figure out how to communicate that as flawed humans. I trust that more than some pristine and perfect book that I can't relate to because it's perfect and I'm clearly not. And honestly, trying to hold that view just doesn't work if you take the time to really read the Bible. The Bible is a record of people's experiences of God and God's experiences with people as we grow and learn and see God more clearly through the generations, and how God continues to be faithful to us through it all. So over the next few weeks, we'll look at more stories from the Bible and learning about them in the time they were written, but also how it might make sense for us today. We'll learn about Peter and that vision he had that lets us eat bacon now, so I love that story. We'll talk about the Tower of Babel and Pentecost. We'll talk about how we can pray the Psalms, prayers of anger, prayers of sadness, prayers of praise. And we'll really look at the whole Sermon on the Mount. All this is happening over the summer here on Digital Dairy Sunday School, and we hope you will join us.